understanding the meaning of this one word will completely change the way that you view the biblical text relationship with monotheism. And this one word is the Hebrew word Elohim, where we get the English translation God or gods. And in this video, I'm going to break down the 6 different types of entities that the biblical authors use the word Elohim to describe. Now, if you were to look up the word monotheism on Merriam-Webster, you will find it defined as the doctrine or belief that there is but one God. And I'm not going to go into the history of this word because biblical scholar Dan McClellan did a fantastic job breaking down the origin and the history behind this word in a recent video, which I'll link below. But as you'll see throughout this video, that view of monotheism is a modern understanding of monotheism. And the biblical text idea of a single supreme deity looks different. So we need to take the biblical text on its own terms. And we'll start with that right now with a breakdown of how Elohim is used throughout the Bible. Now we'll begin with the entity that is described over 2,300 times of the nearly 2,700 uses of Elohim. And that is Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, within the biblical text. And the first example we are given of this is in the beginning with Genesis 1:1, which states, when God began to create the skies and the land. And if you are curious on why I have opted for that translation, I'll link a video in the description below. Next, let's explore what is perhaps the biggest contrast to Elohim describing Yahweh. And that is Elohim describing the deceased prophet Samuel. And we read about this in 1 Samuel 28:13, where King Saul goes to a medium or witch at Endor, where she calls up the prophet Samuel for the king. And when he emerges, she states, I see a spirit form coming up out of the earth. And that word spirit is what the translators have rendered from the Hebrew word Elohim. Now, building on this, the term Elohim also describes demons. And we can see this in Deuteronomy 32:17, which states, they, speaking of the Israelites, sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods whom they had not known, new gods who came from recent times. Their ancestors had not known them. Now, 2 things to point out here. One of those is that this is a very controversial verse. If you look in most Bibles, it's not going to have this translation. I have chosen this translation because it aligns with the scholarly view put forth on this particular passage. Whereas many traditional translations will try to avoid this idea of the demons being equated with gods. It'll say something to the extent of they sacrificed to demons who were no gods. However, it's been well demonstrated that this is a bad translation. And I'll link an article in the description if you want to read more about that. And secondly, this term demons comes from the Hebrew word shedim, which comes from the Akkadian word shedu. And it's important to note that within the ancient Near East, these demons, or shedu, were neutral. It was a term that could refer either to a good or bad spiritual being. It simply depended on the context of how it was used. In addition to demons, we also have the term Elohim being used to describe the gods of the other nations. And perhaps one of the best examples of this is in Judges chapter 10, verse 6, which states, the people of Israel did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth, or Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines, and they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. And you guessed it, every single one of those English word gods is the Hebrew word Elohim. All right, now let's turn our attention to the Psalms, where we see the term Elohim used in 2 different ways, but they are very similar, so I have decided to lump them together. And the first example we see is in Psalm 8, verse 5, which states, yet you have made him, speaking of man, a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. And those 2 English words, heavenly beings, are where the term Elohim is within the Hebrew text. And the second instance is within Psalm 82:1 as well as 82 verse 6. And verse 1 states the following, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, it would be dishonest of me not to mention that this is a hotly debated passage as to what the translation should be. And this is a topic that the late biblical scholar Michael Heiser essentially dedicated his career to. So if you want to know more about God's divine counsel, his work is an absolute must. Now, you probably noticed the term God and gods used within that verse, and both of those are the word Elohim in Hebrew. But what scholars agree on is that the first Elohim is singular and the second Elohim is plural. And this is based on the Hebrew grammar within the sentence. And because we've already covered an example of Elohim referring to Yahweh, I don't want to get into the discussion and debate about the first usage of the term Elohim within this verse. But rather, we'll focus in on that second plural usage of the term Elohim within verse 1. And to do this, we'll jump down to verse 6, where it states, I said. And again, this is a point of debate right here. I'm of the opinion that this is Yahweh speaking. There are others that would disagree with this, but regardless, what is said to these other Elohim is, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. That term gods, again, is the Hebrew term Elohim. And so we see here that these Elohim are members of the divine council of the supreme deity, which again, while there's disagreement on that, I believe it's speaking of Yahweh. And finally, the term Elohim is used to describe the angel of God. We see this in Genesis 31, starting in verse 11, which reads, Then the angel of God, Elohim, said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And then on in verse 13, it says, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now, in fairness, in verse 13, where it says, I am the God of Bethel, it does not use the term Elohim. It uses the term El, which is the root word of the term Elohim. However, if we go back to Genesis 28, this is the famous Jacob's ladder passage, where Jacob encounters Yahweh. This is what it states in verse 13. And behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. Now, in both of those instances, the term for God is Elohim. And so we can see how the terms El and Elohim are used interchangeably here, but perhaps even more important, we see a link between Yahweh and the angel of God. And now that we've seen the numerous entities that the biblical authors use the word Elohim to describe, we see that the word Elohim is vastly different than our current understanding and definition of the English word God or gods. And therefore, we need to rethink our understanding of this word entirely. And the one common thing between all of these various entities that are described as an Elohim is that an Elohim is an entity or being that does not inhabit the natural realm. Or more simply put, an Elohim is a resident of the spiritual realm. And with this proper understanding of what an Elohim is, it can be seen that various passages that seem contradictory to one another, where one will support a polytheistic worldview and the other will support a monotheistic view, can actually be read in harmony. And while there's countless examples of these types of verses, we'll just look at a couple. In Isaiah 44, verse 6, the Lord says, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. And we'll compare this with Deuteronomy 10:17, which states, For Yahweh your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. And while these two verses would cause serious issues for the current understanding of the word God or gods, when the term Elohim is properly defined, there simply isn't an issue. The biblical authors, regardless of the time period that they are writing in, understand that Yahweh is the supreme deity and that no other Elohim can compare to him. And we see this in narratives such as Genesis 1:26 and 27, where it says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And in the next verse it states, So God created man in his own image. And we know this is speaking of God singular because the verbs create are both in the third masculine singular. And it is also the word bara, which is a unique type of creating that is only attributed to Yahweh throughout the entire biblical text. And the Tower of Babel event in Genesis chapter 11 also aligns closely with this type of language, where it states in verse 7, and this is Yahweh speaking, Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. Both of these narratives demonstrate that Yahweh is not alone. There are other divine beings that inhabit the spiritual realm with him, but they are not creating together. This is a divine council setting where a decision is made and then Yahweh is the one that acts upon the decision. And there is also no battling among the gods for control. Yahweh is superior because he is the creator of all of the other Elohim. Now, 1 Kings chapter 22 has a similar narrative to both of these, so I would encourage you to go check that out for yourself. But I believe that these stories, as well as the numerous examples we've looked at of entities described as Elohim, is sufficient to demonstrate that the current term monotheism, as defined in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, does not fit the biblical narrative. However, polytheism does not fit the narrative either. And so perhaps where both ends of the spectrum can meet on this issue is a term that I first heard from Dr. Michael Heiser several years ago, and that is biblical monotheism. And that is the idea that Yahweh is unique among all the other Elohim. To quote him directly, Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. All right, everyone, make sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and check out these videos that YouTube seems to think that you will enjoy. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.